for now.
Okay, thanks. Then we go to the last part, which I want to discuss what does it really actually mean, seen from this perspective of universal wisdom or Theosophia. And to start, we return for a moment to the beginning, where we explained the process of emanation. And there we also talked about this oversoul or hierarch or source consciousness, which is guiding any hierarchy of life. And we explained that there is actually one supreme law, which is the guiding law, you could say, for the source consciousness, which can also be called dharma, or described as duty or justice or righteousness or harmony or compassion, and which is inseparable from divine wisdom or Theosophia itself. Now, for a moment, returning to this question, who determines the order in nature, and are the higher consciousnesses then determining for us with their habits? We explained that the dharma, the law of laws or compassion, shows what is in the end leading in nature. And we have explained that compassion means working from within or inspiring. So from the laws of nature there is not anything or anyone determining anything for another. Nature works from within. And yet this is precisely why we see also so much disharmony in outer nature today. For, as we asked ourselves just before the break, the question, why do we not obey these laws of nature? We will explain this further, using as an outline the development or evolution of consciousness in, well, the large scheme of things. As already told, nature consists of many spheres of existence that relate to each other hierarchically, from the most spiritual to the most material. And in this great hierarchy of life of which we are a part, nature, or cosmos with a capital letter, each being begins as an unself-conscious monad or atom, an unself-conscious God spark or spark of eternity. It starts from the most spiritual plane, a spiritual unity into which everything from a previous cycle is reabsorbed, and which now at the birth of a nature or cosmos begins to differentiate again. Or in other words, in which slowly but surely individual rays or streams arise again from this one spiritual source or core. The direction is then initially towards the physical or material, to develop better and better vehicles in which consciousness can manifest and learn. Then there is a turning point in the most material plane, and the development will be in the direction of the spiritual, with the goal of ultimately becoming self-consciously one with all life within the hierarchy. In other words, a divine level of consciousness. We will then have learned everything there is to learn in this hierarchy of life, in this nature or cosmos. Now the human stage is exactly this turning point, because it is this stage in which we develop self-consciousness with the development of the thinking faculty. We have developed by then a vehicle in which the spiritual can be reflected, so to speak. With self-consciousness we are able to contemplate and direct ourselves. Our free will is thus active not only in the external sphere, as in plants and animals for example, but also in the inner sphere. And with this we can also begin to direct our evolution more independently. Now self-consciousness arises almost at the most material point. According to Theosophia, in this great adventure of the evolution of consciousness, we have only just passed this turning point. So the attraction to matter is still very strong. Or in other words, the temptation to attribute reality above all to the material, the vehicular side, is still great. Now fortunately we are not alone in this evolutionary journey. And with the development of free will, some are also moving faster than others. And so at every level there are beings who, from the motive of compassion, inspire others to go toward this spiritual unity. And so even in the human field we know certain sages or world teachers. And one of them is the Chinese sage Lao Tse, from whom is the following verse that connects to this process of the evolution of consciousness and also gives us an initial answer to this question: why do we not obey these laws of nature? It is verse 38 from his Tao Te King, or a book of Tao and Te, where Tao stands for the one life, you might say, and the path to it, but which can also be seen as the boundless principle. And Te means virtue. Lao Tse writes, when Tao is lost, there is goodness. When goodness is lost, there is kindness. When kindness is lost, there is justice. And when justice is lost, there is ritual. Then in another verse, Lao Tse writes the following about laws. The more prohibitions and rules, the poorer people become. The sharper people's weapons, the more they riot. The more elaborate the laws, the more they commit crimes. Let's go into this verse more or less sentence by sentence. Because this verse by Lao Tse also eloquently indicates how mentality and outward behavior are related. If we no longer recognize and trust the spiritual side in ourselves, we will not recognize and trust it in others either. I cite again what is told about the indigenous Native American people, where they saw nature or land as something belonging to everyone, which you have on loan and have to pass on to the next 7 generations. The Europeans that came, the colonists, arrived with a very different mentality. And it even involved the Pope, who in 1493 issued a papal bull stating that a Christian could appropriate a territory if it belonged to pagans. So with that the Indians lost their land at once. You see how prohibitions and rules make people poorer. We can also recognize the following line when we talk about, for instance, the US with its free firearm ownership, and at the same time a huge number of deaths from gun violence. For example, the probability of being killed by gun violence in the US is about 77 times greater than in a country like Germany. But this is just as true of a weapon on a mental level. Just think of the effects of free speech on social media. For example, hate messages on Facebook led to genocide of the Rohingya clan in Myanmar, among other things. And since Elon Musk owns Twitter, or X, and refuses to protect it from hate speech, things haven't been much merrier there either. Now when it comes to the laws in the last line of this verse, one way you can recognize this is the tendency to impose harsher and heavier punishment when crimes are committed. While there is now a great deal of research and evidence that rehabilitation and restorative justice are many times more effective. With punishment we try to change people from the outside instead of from the inside, which is much more sustainable and helps to prevent recidivism. Now the good news is that thanks to more and more research and science, we are finding out that our current mentality fails in all sorts of things. Only there is still a lack of a common vision that can help us out of these vicious circles. Because why do we not obey the laws of nature? Because, in generally, we still do not recognize them. So we do not acknowledge them and therefore also do not live by them. And in order to live them, we also need to understand firstly what they are, as we discussed, these universal fundamental laws, like the 3 propositions or the 7 jewels of wisdom. And of course, we have to know where or who they come from, and that they are really inherent to nature, and that equals saying that they are inherent to our own innermost nature. And also we have to recognize why they are right, and that they are based on this law of laws, divine compassion, eternal harmony that really resonates with this ethical intuition that we have. And lastly, we have to know how we can apply them. And exactly that is what we are going to talk about now, because by now we have explained what they are, from where or from whom they come, and why they are right to follow. So just as an overview, you can say that working on with nature is starting from and living by these laws of nature, the 3 fundamental propositions and the 7 jewels of wisdom. And that's actually true for all of them. But in this lecture series we will focus mainly on the 3rd principle, the 3rd proposition, and also the 3rd jewel of wisdom, the doctrine of hierarchies of consciousness and the process of emanation. In this regard we have also already considered the meaning of the 4 jewels of reincarnation and that of karma in the previous 2 lecture series. And the following jewels will also be more central in the next series, in the coming series of the season. But in any case, each principle cannot be separated from all the others. So even if you pick one, it is only one facet of the same truth in which the others are also embedded. And all the teachings or laws of nature are integral parts of each other, telling how all life, how nature as a whole or as a unit evolves or develops. So to work on with nature is, among other things, to start from this idea of hierarchies of consciousness and the process of emanation. Now we have tried in this lecture to briefly explain what that means. How nature is guided from the inside out, from the spiritual plane through the mental to the material plane. And now we want to dwell on a concrete social example of a hierarchy, namely our state government. For within that field we make many decisions about how we deal with nature. Now the idea of hierarchy or something hierarchical in society generally does not have such a positive connotation with most people. And this is because all too often we see hierarchies created on the basis of power, whereas the natural hierarchy exists on the basis of consciousness and compassion, as we have seen. Now we will make a small digression, also given current events, to Plato's ideas about hierarchical government in a republic. And this is, I think, very topical in the light of democratic elections scheduled for 2 billion people in this year 2024. In his dialogue The Republic, Plato describes a similar decline in mentality as Lao Tse did in his verses from the Tao Te King, when it comes to following the law. Plato describes the ideal state as one in which the best or wisest among men rule. And the next best form of state is then that of the ambitious or the democracy, a kind of military regime as existed in Sparta in Plato's time. The next stage of deterioration is when the state is ruled by the rich or the oligarchy. Then democracy is the second worst form of state, and that may soon fall into autocracy or dictatorship with the tyrant in power. We dwell on this only briefly, because this is Plato's best known division of state forms. But he made a more detailed and nuanced division, with a clear role for obeying the law, in another and probably a later dialogue called the Politikos, or the Statesman. In this dialogue, the Statesman, Plato is somewhat less negative about democracy as a form of government. Central to the dialogue is what the profession of a statesman entails. And here Plato, like Lao Tse, outlines as an ideal a form of government in which there is no need for laws, because everyone obeys the law of laws. There is a natural harmony. There's justice, there's compassion. And the one who knows what is best for the whole and is most committed to achieving this is the natural leader or king philosopher, as he is also called. A selfless, wise and compassionate leader who is also recognized and acknowledged as such by the people, since they have also made this compassionate and wise in themselves leading. For all these forms of state in Plato's dialogues are nothing really but metaphors for states of consciousness within ourselves. And the highest state he actually describes as a union with nature, in which all our thoughts, our actions and behaviors are subordinate to the law, to compassion, to harmony or righteousness. It also means the complete happiness, or as Plato calls it in Greek, eudaimonia, in which our duty coincides with that of nature as a whole. A kind of completely moving along with the rhythm of, or playing along with the harmony of nature. Furthermore, you can see a correspondence in the following 6 levels of governance. From a government by an individual, one king, to a group of closely cooperating people in the aristocracy, to a people as a whole in the democracy. In the 3 higher forms of government, each obeying the law. And then when we get to the 3 lower forms of government, we see firstly the people in a democracy not obeying the law as a whole, then a group not obeying the law in the oligarchy, and finally an individual not obeying the law in a tyranny, an autocracy or a dictatorship. Now, as we said, these are also metaphors, so we can substitute the governor of a state to a thought in our own way of thinking, to translate this to states of consciousness within ourselves. We can also be guided by one single overarching universal ideal, for example, in line with the laws of nature or in line with our conscience. This thought is then like the Philosopher King or king in our mind, you could say. For instance, the idea of unity or compassion. Another point is that our thinking can also be guided by a union of coherent thoughts or ideals, or by a more loose collection of thoughts and ideas that are correspondingly somewhat less coherent. And that can turn into a collection or range of thoughts that are not in line with the laws of nature or with our conscience. And if we keep that up, that leads to an increasingly limited group of ideas, until finally, at the end of the spectrum, there is a kind of one thought, a kind of obsession, not in line with our conscience, that in fact completely absorbs us. It's like a tyrant in our thinking. For instance, when we have a thought of hate, for instance. Now this is the fate of the tyrant, himself actually. Plato describes him as an addict. He no longer has self-control. He is addicted to his uncontrolled, unrestrained desire. It's like this obsession in his thinking that is ruling himself. Whether it is a desire for power or for wealth or pleasure, it is for the most part an external desire and therefore at the same time the most perishable. And for that very reason he is also the most afraid of losing something. All the material things he gathers, or the wealth he gathers, or the status he gathers, it's all also perishable, and inwardly this tyrant knows it and is afraid of losing it. And in fact, Plato describes this tyrant is ruled by fear. Now the oligarchy is the second worst form of state in this list from the Statesman. Here a small group of rich people are in charge who, moreover, do not care about the laws but only about their own self-interest or power. Then democracy is not the second lowest form of government but the third lowest form of government in this division. But it is at a critical midpoint. For as we all know, the majority is not always morally right either. Democratic governance that harms minorities and thus does not follow certain fundamental rights or the ethical laws of nature can quickly degenerate. And this is very timely in these days of populism. For example, democracy and the rule of law in Hungary is barely functional anymore, according to experts, and democracy in Poland has skimmed along the edge of the cliff. And in our country, the Netherlands, we also now have a discussion about fundamental rights in our laws. By the way, we are not telling this from any particular political conviction. The Theosophia or ancient wisdom is above politics. But we use Plato's message to show that everything reflects our own nature. Even our form of government is a reflection of what we inwardly value. Our ideas are reflected in political systems, which in turn ultimately determine policy, including policy about how to deal or interact with nature. And whether we look to the left or the right spectrum of politics, the shared mentality is still predominantly materialistic. And so are the political systems, both communism and capitalism, socialism or liberalism. Now Plato also called this materialistic mentality driven by material desire a feverish mentality. And theosophically, I think this is a very good comparison. Because as we know, feverishness in our thinking and acting eventually also leads to fever in our bodies. And now when you look at the earth as a living being, you can see parallels to feverishness in many ways. And I don't just mean a rising temperature, but actually all of its consequences. Forest fires, heats, floods, etc. And moreover, even phenomena like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, according to Theosophia, cannot be separated from our mentality, our thinking and actions as humanity as a whole. We, as the human realm of nature, have influence on all realms below us. And besides the animals and plants, also the minerals and the elemental realms, even though we may not see and realize that. Now a step further toward harmony is then the aristocracy. And in this division, this is not the supreme form. In our society you can partially recognize this in our democracy. For example, when ministers are elected because they actually understand the issues for which they become responsible, and not just because they have been in an eligible position. And many well-functioning democracies also have, for example, a separation of powers, with representatives of the people controlling the government and also with a Supreme Court. Furthermore, many countries also have all kinds of influential advisory boards and regulators to see that the government obeys its own laws. Consider, for example, a variety of councils or authorities on public health, environmental issues, children's rights, etc. The next best form is to have an inspiring leader who selflessly knows how to best serve the whole. Consider a leader like Mahatma Gandhi. Even though he was never an official elected president, he had more influence on the country than any politician of his era. And it is also safe to say that this is still true today. And in the past, in India, for example, there has also been the Buddhist king Ashoka, who preached religious tolerance throughout the country, and who tried to inspire the people primarily in spiritual ways. Then there is the highest form, according to Plato, in which a human being leads a people or country from what you could say really a higher level of consciousness. And then there is harmony and justice for all. In the Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky describes how in the early days of human history there were such leaders. Divine dynasties of kings, and for instance in ancient Egypt, there was also a period when initiated pharaohs ruled the land. Leaders who, as Lao Tse would say, did not get in front of the people, but governed them from behind the people. In other words, from within. And in Theosophy we then speak of the already mentioned hierarchy of compassion, with its own human representatives working on this earth. From Chelas to Mahatmas to human bodhisattvas and Buddhas, who are themselves representing celestial bodhisattvas and Buddhas. Now Herman Vermeulen will explain much more about this in his lecture series in April about compassion, the law of laws. So we see in these descriptions two forms of hierarchy. That of the hierarchy of power, leading to an ever-increasing limitation, actually, corresponding to enslavement at the level of consciousness, so to speak. It's not the human being who rules then, but the enslavement to something external, the thought of power, of pleasure, or wealth. And the other form of hierarchy follows the more natural hierarchy of compassion or light based on authority. And this leads to true liberation of the inner nature and to enlightenment. And these two directions correspond to the two schools of thought within ourselves. So you can actually say the choice is ours. As humans, we have developed free will to consciously lead our evolution in line with the flow of nature, an ever-expanding spiritual development of the whole. So would this perspective help us also on the path to a more harmonious outer nature? We will leave that conclusion to yourself. Now finally, to summarize the main ideas from this part, we dove into one of the laws of nature, the hierarchical composition in which all beings work together to evolve. And from the human stage, we are developing self-consciousness, we explained. And that can lead and with that self-consciousness, we can lead our evolution independently from a God spark to a self-conscious God. We also discussed that this harmony arises from loss of our sense of oneness with nature, or we can also call it the loss of the Tao, or the law, or justice. Because when we see ourselves separate from nature, trying to rule nature, then we will only be opposed by nature and are swimming against the stream, so to say. And we discussed that all hierarchies of nature are reflected in ourselves. And that if we follow the hierarchy of light or compassion in ourselves first, that we will not fall into a hierarchy of power. And it means to recognize in ourselves our oneness with nature as a whole and working on with her. And then nature will regard us as one of her creators and make obeisance, as Blavatsky tells us. Okay, this was the summary of the last part, and again a short break of 3 minutes and some time for questions. See you soon. Okay, welcome back. Astrid, any questions?
Yes, we have questions. The first one is, are we humans the only beings that do not work on with nature?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I explained, the human phase of evolution is a kind of critical phase, because then we develop our how do you say, our self-consciousness and independent thinking, and then without being really already opened up for the spiritual influences which are above the mental level. But the thing is, we also, and I will explain more about that in the next lecture, but we also have a responsibility towards the realms of nature coming after us. So actually our mental thought atmosphere also influences, for instance, animals and plants. And it is said in Theosophy that the strife we see now in nature between animals killing each other, for instance, will be much less as we progress as human beings, and also will behave more in harmony and work from a more spiritual perspective. So there we have influences. We are influencing animals who, in a certain way, you could say, go against nature. It's not so. You cannot really say that, because animals are just following their instincts, but they could behave more in harmony as their examples would be more in harmony. Then again, there is always free will, and there will always be a choice. So even if we progress and become more spiritual and will enter other realms of nature, we discuss Theosophy also talks about that, more spiritual realms, and we can call that bodhisattvas, Buddhas, or Dhyani Chohans, all kinds of names. But higher forms of consciousness than the human consciousness. For us, that would be more, a lot more in line with nature. Actually, we would, from our human point of view, say, okay, they're perfectly aligned with nature. But on their level, there is still choice, there's still free will, and actually there probably will be also working with and against, more or less. Mm-hmm. So that is a conclusion we can draw. It's all relative. Yeah, it's all relative. That's a conclusion we can draw from one of these jewels of wisdom, the two paths, that it's on every level of consciousness there is always free will, and there's always a choice to align with the whole, or to choose for yourself, so to say. Yeah. So from our standpoint, we see it as they are all working with nature, but when we will be at their level, we will see a difference. And
so then, is it possible to work on with nature like 100%?
Well, in a sense, I would say it is possible, because there is also, if we describe nature as being guided always from a certain hierarchy, so there is always this inspiration from this hierarchy we can follow. So in theory, it is possible to follow completely the inspiration, but of course there is evolution, and there is always a sort of limitation. So we can only follow what we are able to understand and what is according to our evolution. So I guess in that sense, So it's a yes and a no. In that sense, we can do it, but only on our limited level, so to say. So on our human level, for instance, well, we have to learn, but in the ideal situation, we grow up listening exactly to our parents who tell us what to do, and of course we know we are also independent beings and want to find out for ourselves, and then make mistakes and do things otherwise, and not that our parents, of course, are completely all-knowing, and
Yeah,
So-
that actually brings us to the second question. It's like, when we die, are we reminded by the laws of nature? Sometimes we say about children that they seem to be more in line with nature. They have this feeling of justice, of sharing. Can you say something about that?
Yes, sure. I think it's two situations. I think the situation when we die, what happens, and Theosophy has some very interesting things to say about that, and when we grow up as children. Of course, from a consciousness point of view, we are no blank sheets as children. And at the end of our lives, Theosophy explains that everyone has a panoramic vision. And what happens is, more or less, we talked about this threefold division, that we, as the learning part, the soul, that the higher part of the soul is for a short time in this panoramic vision, one with a more eternal part. I wouldn't say with the monad, but something in between, you might say.
Very inspirational.
Yes. So we get the perspective from actually a part in ourselves, more a re-embodying part in ourselves that has the overview not only from this life but multiple incarnations. And it means that, as Theosophy describes it, in this panoramic vision, we see the justice of everything that happened to us in this life. And it means that a lot of things happen to us in this life of which we cannot see the causes that led to it. And there are many things that happen to us and which have, of course, their causes in previous lives. And then we, from this perspective of this higher part in ourselves, we see the justice of it. We can see that the things that happened to us in this life, of which we might think they were, well, not to be justified or felt as unfair, we can see the fairness of it, the justice of it, because it has it already effects from causes we have sown ourselves in previous lives. So it is a way to be more, to have an insight in the law of karma, you could say, in one of the laws of nature. Yeah. Actually, all the laws of nature, because I guess if you take one, the law of karma, it connects to also being in a hierarchy, part of a larger part. I guess we also see ourselves connected more. So I guess we have more insight in these laws of nature, and that will become part of our conscience, it is described. So when we are born again, as little infants, we are still close to that situation of being at one. Actually, in this rest period after the panoramic vision, where we are in this sphere where we actually are reliving our highest ideals, so to say, and also our best insights of these laws of nature. And they're still pretty much fresh when we grow up as a child. And also as a child, and that's another teaching from Theosophy, we are reiterating actually parts of our evolution as a human being in the small. So there was a time in our evolution when we, as, like, say, an infant humanity, live together with on this earth with spiritual beings. A short time, it's not now the case, but then we were more in contact with these spiritual beings. And we see that reflecting in our childhood when we have, like when we are young, much more the influence from our parents, and we are much more also, how do you say, connected to our parents and devoted to our parents. That's also a time when we are more intuitively feel these laws of nature, have an intuitively feeling of justice, of harmony, of beauty, of, well, all these things. So yeah, I think that lines up very well. Yeah.
Okay. That was the last question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your attention. Next week we will have the study meeting for this lecture. So do not forget to register for the study meeting, and we will publish soon the study material connected to this lecture also on our website about, for instance, what are laws of nature, some more insight from the Theosophical literature. Next week in the study meeting we can also share our ideas about the more practical application. How does this idea of hierarchies of consciousness also help us to work on with nature and to create more harmony? And after that we will go into another very timely and important subject, the issue of migration. And we will look closer into the relation between nature's processes and the way we cooperate with or against these processes in human society, considering migration. So we all hope to see you all then. And as we always do, we close this lecture with the Gayatri of the Rig Veda, a call to actually our higher self that senses its oneness with nature, here called the Golden Sun. O thou Golden Sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.